All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Ray Speciale, and I'm a lawyer with AOPA's Legal Services Plan. I'm joined tonight by my colleague from AOPA, Jared Allen.
Good evening.
And we've got two special guests on the line from the FAA, Jeff Smith and J.B. Williams. I'll introduce everyone a bit more formally in a few moments. The topic for this webinar is FAA's compliance philosophy. The FAA initiated its compliance philosophy in fall 2015. We thought that this would be a good opportunity to reflect on the program with a little more than 1 year of experience under our belts. AOPA is very grateful to our guests from the FAA this evening, Jeff Smith and J.B. Williams. They graciously offered their time with us this evening, and they've prepared a very informative presentation for you. While Jared and I have dealt with hundreds of cases in the last year or so dealing with the FAA's new compliance philosophy, Jeff and JB have dealt directly or indirectly with thousands. We invite your questions as the presentation unfolds. There should be a prompt on your computer screen that will allow you to submit questions. Unfortunately, we never seem to get to every question, but we'll try our best to cover as much ground as possible in the available time. Thanks again for joining us, and please allow me to introduce our webinar participants for this evening. Jeff Smith is currently on detail to the Director of Flight Standards as part of the Compliance Philosophy Focus Team. Jeff holds an ATP certificate, is a flight and ground instructor, and he's certificated as an A&P mechanic. He's a cadet orientation pilot, mission pilot, instructor, and check pilot for the Civil Air Patrol. JB is assigned to the FAA Safety Team, and he serves on the Compliance Philosophy Focus Team. JB is primarily responsible for remedial training for the Compliance Philosophy Focus Team, but he also handles guidance relating to the FAST Team. JB holds an ATP with DC-9 and SK-65 type ratings, as well as a DC-10 flight engineering rating. JB has flown for the U.S. Air Force, commuter airlines, as well as Continental Airlines before joining the FAA. JB currently owns a Titan Tornado S model, which, by the way, JB, I looked up a little bit earlier and I hadn't seen one. They're pretty cool. And has owned a Dragonfly, Longies, C-172, Mooney Statesman, and an RV-6A. Jared Allen is AOPA's Legal Services Plan Senior Staff Attorney and an instrument-rated private pilot. He provides initial consultations to pilots through the Legal Services Plan here at AOPA. Jared has assisted hundreds of pilots successfully navigate FAA's compliance program. I'm a lawyer in CFII. I've been privileged to work with AOPA Legal Service Plan members since 1988. Jeff and JB, when you're ready, please proceed.
Great, thanks, Ray. Nice introduction, and good evening, everyone. So tonight we're going to take a look at the compliance philosophy, and we're going to go through an overview. Now, the compliance philosophy has a lot of aspects to it, but we're going to focus on the investigation and the potential outcome after a regulatory deviation. And we're going to look at some of the information that's in our guidance as well as lessons and information that we've learned over the past year. So cutting right to it, the compliance philosophy allows the FAA to use a less stringent means called compliance actions to gain compliance when the person is willing and able to take corrective action. And the FAA also identifies intentional or reckless behavior as the highest risk for safe operations. And it is those high-risk operations that will require enforcement for regulatory deviations. And I'd just like to note that this is not necessarily the kindler and gentler FAA, but rather the shift with the compliance philosophy is a focus on fixing regulatory deviations so that we can ensure safety within the national airspace system.
And Jeff, I have a question for you. Most of our members and listeners are either aircraft owners or pilots. But is this something that would apply to those same individuals if they hold something like a mechanic certificate, or is this only limited to pilot certificate holders?
Great question, Jared. This applies to anyone who is in the National Airspace System. So pilots, mechanics, other certificate holders, and even passengers that don't hold certificates would also fall under the compliance philosophy. Okay, next slide here. So what does the compliance philosophy mean to you as individual certificate holders? Well, previous to the implementation of compliance philosophy, and just for some context, we noted that we're looking at a recap after 1 year. The compliance philosophy within the FAA started to be implemented in the summer of 2015. Flight standards, which includes aviation safety inspectors that most of you all are probably familiar with, our enabling guidance was published in October of 2015. So previous to those time frames, the FAA focused on enforcement and gathering items of proof. And enforcement was the primary means of ensuring regulatory compliance. So if there was a apparent regulatory deviation, the FAA would typically go into enforcement mode. And then the action that the FAA took was based largely on the outcome or the potential outcome. So was there an accident? Was there a near mid-air collision? Was the event scary, or could it have been scary? So it was really outcome-based when we looked at what the appropriate sanction would be on an enforcement action. Then fast-forwarding to our current state with the compliance philosophy, we're going to take a compliance action, again, a non-enforcement resolution to the issue will be taken unless a determination is made that compliance action is not appropriate. We'll talk about some of those details later on. And the focus now has shifted from an enforcement and punishment to finding the best corrective action that properly addresses the safety issue and properly mitigates the risk. And we're putting an emphasis on voluntary compliance and information exchange and the use of safety management principles. Now, we only have a limited time on the webinar, so we won't be able to get into detail on all of those aspects. Like I said, we're going to focus on the investigation and possible outcome. But these are some other areas that the compliance philosophy focuses on or expands within the agency. And the action that the FAA is going to take is going to be based on the underlying behaviors as opposed to the potential outcome, which, if you think about it, makes some sense. If there's a knowledge or a skill deficiency that caused the regulatory violation, and we don't correct that underlying knowledge or skill, then the problem is still going to be present, and the risk to the system is still going to be present. So the focus needs to be on addressing those underlying issues. And maybe a quick way to illustrate that is think about flying late at night, and you inadvertently enter into Class D airspace. Now, there's nobody else around, so at first it would seem, well, okay, no harm, no foul. But we got to look at the underlying behaviors that caused that incursion, and we want to correct those, because perhaps there's an issue with not understanding the navigation charts or the requirements to contact the tower, or perhaps there's an issue with navigation and the pilot ended up in a place and they thought they were somewhere else. And we got to correct that, because if not, then there may be another airspace incursion, this time in the middle of the day where it's busier and there's the increased potential for collision. So we're getting away from what the outcome of the event was, and we're looking at a focus on underlying behaviors. This is a quote from Administrator Huerta, and I put this up here for several reasons. One is to show that the compliance philosophy applies to the entire FAA. This isn't just a project that's coming out of one particular office. This is agency-wide. And the FAA continues to make this a priority from the administrator on downward. When the compliance philosophy was first implemented back in 2015, the administrator, as well as other executives, put out messages. The administrator had a town hall for FAA employees that was specific to the compliance philosophy. And that message has continued up until now. Last week, the FAA administrator hosted another internal town hall, and while the focus wasn't on the compliance philosophy, the administrator did talk about it, gave some of the numbers that we saw from last year, talked about the success of the program, and provided an example of a compliance action. So all of that is keeping the compliance philosophy in the minds of FAA employees. So really a sustained campaign from the top down. And also within flight standards, we have undertaken change management to ensure that the changes with the compliance philosophy are made and are as intended and are long-lasting. Previous within flight standards, historically, we would publish a piece of guidance. We would expect not only our internal workforce to immediately adopt to it, but also those external to the FAA, that the document affected. And of course, that just doesn't work. We're all human beings. We all learn things at different rates. We change at different rates. And so by using change management principles, we have focused on appropriate messaging, both internally and externally, the appropriate training for our workforce, and we've set up feedback mechanisms so our workforce can provide us comments. Also, we receive and welcome comments from those external to the FAA. AOPA has been a big player in that in providing us feedback, and we recently made a rather large revision to some of our internal guidance, most of it based upon feedback that we received over the past year. So this is something that is being taken very seriously within the FAA overall, as well as within flight standards. And with that, JB, I will hand it over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. And this is a huge change for the FAA, and Jeff mentioned earlier that it isn't the gentler, kinder FAA philosophy. It's a whole change in how we do business. We're primarily focused now on fixing the problem, and how we fix that problem. The number one way, of course, that is very critical to the success of the compliance philosophy is that open and transparent exchange of information. We have to have that to be able to find out the root cause of the problem, address that problem with the appropriate compliance action, whether that be a remedial training or some other type of training, or whatever it happens to be. We can't do that without the help of the airman that was involved and all those other people. Maybe it's air traffic or an operator, an FBO, whoever it is. So we're very serious about opening up a dialogue with the airmen and making it so that you don't feel like, anything I tell the FAA, that's going to be held against me. We're trying to move away from that. And part of that is, and this, of course, is probably a huge problem on the mind of any aircraft owner or pilot. I mean, I'm a pilot and aircraft owner, and I think of the same things as, we don't want someone to hide a mistake just because they're feared that they're going to get suspended, privilege taken away, something's going to happen to them. So what we're trying to do is bring everything out in the open and have that free exchange of information to let the airmen know, here's what we're doing, here's what we're looking at, we want to fix the problem, and part of that is to identify that problem. So, if you're trying to hide it and you're not talking to the FAA, that can, slow down the process of actually fixing the problem. So, and of course, this is a thing that can take time. Probably some people have had some bad experiences with the FAA. Some have had some real good experiences with the FAA, but it's something that's going to take time. And this is a good way to do this is kind of look back over the year and see where we've been and where we're going. And so it'll be a real good summation, you know, of what we're trying to do. One of the things we want to do, not only identify the problem, is learn from that mistake. In other words, why did we make the mistake? What was the root cause of the mistake? How can we avoid it in the future? And then once we implement the fix, of course, to prevent a reoccurrence, we have to validate. And as Jeff had mentioned earlier, you know, if you have identified a problem and you recommend a particular training or a fix to the problem, you have to make sure that that fix was the correct fix, it did fix the problem, and that it's effective. So sometimes we have follow-up that we do in a compliance action to make sure not only that we identified the correct problem, but it fixed the problem. Because, you know, if we don't fix that underlying cause, it just happens to reoccur over and over again. And part of how we do this is really safety management. And we're just going to go over some of the principles of safety management. And a lot of aircraft owners and pilots practice safety management even if you don't know you are. You know, the first part of safety management, of course, is that the FAA expects certificate holders, pilots, airmen, mechanics, to comply with the regulations. Just like if you're driving your car, you know, the state expects you to follow the rules of the road. Same thing, you know, when you're a pilot. So that's just a baseline expectation. And then part of safety management is not reactive but proactive. And something as simple as using a checklist, a lot of pilots let get away from them, especially, let's say you're flying a Cessna 150, which is a fairly simple airplane. You know, once you get out of flight training and away from a flight training environment, sometimes the use of that checklist kind of over time, you know, I know the airplane, you know, I know the checklist. You know, that runs away from us. And then we get in a little more complex airplane, and then it really runs away from us. So even the simple things can help in risk management. Using a flight risk analysis tool, a FRAT, there are many different FRATs on the market and available. They're sometimes as simple as a Excel spreadsheet that has questions and risk points. You know, what's the weather? How much sleep have you had? You know, do you have any stress in your life? And looking at all the risk factors that affect a particular flight and a particular mission. And then you have iPhone apps and operators, you know, commercial operators have, you know, computer programs that are, you know, have 50 to 100 questions that have to be answered prior to any flight being dispatched. So that there are different types of flight risk analysis tools, but there are simple ones just for the general aviation pilot as well. And then another area where a lot of pilots don't think about is what are your personal minimums? You know, we've always heard about, you know, get home-itis and, you know, not letting a schedule dictate the mission or the safety of a flight. But really adhering and having personal minimums, you know, and if you can't say what your personal minimums are, well, you know, we know what VFR minimums are, but maybe you need, you know, instead of 1,003, maybe yours is 3,005, you know, 3,000-foot ceiling and 5 miles visibility. You know, depending on the aircraft you're in, let's say you switch from a Cessna 150 to a complex aircraft, you know, a Mooney 20G model, you know, retractable gear, controllable pitch propeller. You know, you've got a Garmin 530 in there. Well, you know, the risk factor of all that advanced equipment really increases the risk if you've been flying a 150 and you know, you're going to go do an IFR flight. So personal minimums for the mission, for the weather, you know, for stress in your life, all these things take the factors when you're talking about risk management. Okay, so we'll just go a high-level overview of the investigative process and how we get down to deciding, and it's really, in a nutshell, it's very simple. We identify a non-compliance by either getting a report from air traffic, a tower calls and says, somebody just ran off the runway, or we get a pilot deviation, airspace violation of some type. And of course, that comes to the Flight Standards District Office of FSDO. And of course, then we start a fact-finding investigation to find out, okay, what occurred. And so the inspector will start to collect information. And once they get enough information, they have to decide, is a compliance action appropriate? And that's either a yes or no question. And, there are some easy yes and no's. If we find a single-engine pilot who was flying a multi-engine aircraft and wasn't rated as a multi-engine pilot, a compliance action is probably not appropriate because it was intentional. They didn't have a multi-engine rating. They knew they didn't have a multi-engine rating, and that's probably an enforcement action route. Let's say that someone, heavy crosswind, don't have a lot of tail experience. They kind of veer off the runway and run off the runway and hit a taxiway light. That is probably going to be a candidate for an appropriate compliance action, probably some remedial training. And then we assign a particular compliance action. Let's say it's remedial training. The pilot goes through the remedial training, completes it successfully. The case is closed out, and we look at, is the problem fixed? And there may be some follow-up action. The FAA may follow up, 3 or 4 months later, and see how the pilot is doing. See, get some feedback from that airman. How was that training? Did it really address a problem? Have you had any issues, since then? And all this is documented, and so that in the future, we have this data to look back historically and see what works and what didn't work.
JB, just a quick question there. With the documentation that you guys are keeping on this, is that something, I know a lot of airmen want to know, does that wind up in their record? Can others access that if they were looking for a job later on? Is it treated like a violation? If you can answer that briefly, I know you're going to get into some of that later, but I know that the documentation question does come up pretty frequently with members.
I'll let Jeff answer that since he's more on deals with the recordation and retention of records. Jeff?
Yeah, thanks, and good question. So the FAA does not consider a compliance action to be an enforcement action. We do not document, overall, we do not document a compliance action in the same manner. So an enforcement action is entered into our enforcement information system, and information on the enforcement action is kept within that database. We also have another database, PTRS, Program Tracking and Reporting Subsystem, where really all of the work of the inspector is entered in and coded. So that would include enforcements, it would include compliance actions, it would include when you visit the FSDO and you renew your CFI or apply for a student pilot rating, it would include the routine surveillance. So it's really kind of a catch-all system. And that is where the information on a compliance action will be stored. Now, when the inspector, or if the inspector sees that you've had a regulatory violation, so perhaps doing a ramp check and sees something, and goes back and checks within the system, they'll be able to see if there was a previous compliance action or not. And then that might tailor the discussion with you, based upon that history. But it is contained within our databases. It is accessible. It's not accessible through PRIA, the Pilot Records Improvement Act. It won't be something that is submitted as part of that process. There are ways to get data from really any federal agency through FOIA, and the FAA is no exception. we are taking a look at trying to extend the voluntary protection for information that is submitted as part of an investigation that leads to a compliance action. So those conversations are happening now. And the FAA has a retention and expunction policy. So certain records are expunged on a regular basis. Administrative actions, for example, are expunged from our system within 2 years. And so there's conversation as to whether or not that will happen for compliance actions or not. But as it stands right now, we are treating compliance actions as really any activity that the inspector does, and we are certainly not considering it to be an enforcement action. So, JB, back to you, sir.
Okay. So probably what everyone wants to know is contact between the FAA and the airmen. One of the things that we're really wanting an inspector to do is stay engaged. To keep that communication open between the airman and the inspector to make sure that each understand any factors involved during the process of this compliance action. And that really, we need that to make sure it's an unbiased investigation, to make sure that we get all the information, all the facts, identify the actual root of the problem, and then mitigate the risk involved with that problem. So the FAA is going to call the airmen, get facts, ask questions, analyze, and part of that is to see, is there compliance? Did the person realize what happened, why it happened, and that there was a risk involved? And of course, the most valuable information obviously comes from the airman, the person that was involved in the deviation, and that helps us determine what will be the appropriate response and what will fix the problem. And we have a wide range of items that we can use as tools to correct a problem, anywhere from just counseling, which is just, if it's a simple issue, talking with the airman and the airman realized, hey, that was a stupid mistake, and it wasn't a big safety risk, and they can talk that out right there, and what can be done in the future to avoid those situations, all the way to a full-blown remedial training program, which would involve, could involve several hours of instruction, both in ground and the air, depending on what the issue was. So it isn't just a cut and dry, black and white solution. It's tailored to each individual incident that happened and how it happened, and the people involved in that, and what type of training do they get. It may be a system failure. Maybe ATC is involved, maybe an FBO. So it isn't just a simple thing to be able to identify a problem and then mitigate it with the right corrective action. Now, any correspondence from the FAA concerning compliance action is going to contain certain items. And one of those that you may get is a statement that you may, it appears that after the investigation, this fact-finding that the aviation safety inspector does, that you're eligible for a compliance action. And they make it clear also that enforcement action is not being pursued based on the known information at that time. Now, depending on what happens during the investigation, that may change, but oftentimes that isn't the case. Once basic facts are known and the ASI feels comfortable with offering a compliance action, usually, except in a few cases, the compliance action, some type of compliance action is used.
But JB, I'm sorry, with this we're seeing, at least I'm seeing this done more often verbally rather than through written correspondence. Is this now just getting kicked into the system?
Well, it really depends on what phase the process is at. initially, you know, an inspector may call an airman and try to just get the basic facts to see what happened, see the compliance attitude of the airman, get their side of the story. And so, you know, once the ASI may just be getting some information and being able to get it while it's fresh. In other words, it just happened, trying to get it in contact with the airman as soon as possible so that they can take care of the, you know, because one of the major factors of any type of compliance action is to stop the unsafe act or the incident that caused the unsafe or the risk. So it's getting that risk taken care of. So it's a timely thing that we want to get this taken care of as soon as possible, and part of that is finding out as soon as possible what happened. Now that should be followed up by written correspondence where, you know, a compliance action is offered and what that compliance action is. So, you know, it could go, you know, there's going to have to be some written communications, but there'll probably be some oral communications at first.
Thanks. Very helpful.
Part of the requirement when a compliance action is going to be taken is we want to make sure that the airman knows, you know, what a compliance action is, what the compliance philosophy is, and what their rights are. And part of that is providing the airman with a brochure during initial contact that here's what the compliance philosophy is, you know, a good overview, what's involved in the process, and what their rights are as airmen, so that they're fully aware of what their rights are during the process. You know, what questions they can ask, you know, what information that they're allowed to get, that you know, they're automatically guaranteed to get. And it explains especially your right to get legal counsel and to request air traffic data. And Jeff will explain in the upcoming slides about, you know, seeking legal representation doesn't mean you're non-compliant or that you're not working or cooperating with the FAA. That is your right, and the FAA, you know, realizes that. So we don't hold that against airmen. And,
right.
Jeff,
And JB, I would just add real quick, when it comes to the Pilot's Bill of Rights, that when members call in the Legal Services Plan and have questions about being contacted by an inspector, you know, I encourage them that certainly if you get a phone call from an aviation safety inspector, you may be at work, you may be somewhere that's not convenient, and they may be asking about an event that occurred days, weeks, or possibly even months ago. And so I encourage members that, you know, certainly if you need time to think about the answers to what the inspector's asking you, certainly feel free to be polite and let the inspector know that you're absolutely willing to cooperate and can provide him the information that he's asking, but you would like to perhaps set up a time for a callback. You can ask him to send you that Pilot's Bill of Rights so you can read it, and so you can, you know, thoroughly understand, you know, the types of things you're entitled to, like the air traffic data, which can be something like the radar data or ATC recordings or even possibly statements from the controllers. And having all that information emailed to you prior to really talking about the substance of the matter could really be helpful in making sure that when you are providing this information to the FAA that you're recalling everything correctly and that you're not making statements that may not actually be accurate based on your recollection. So I would just encourage our listeners to keep that in mind if they are contacted by an inspector.
Yeah, and we fully understand that, and again, that is something that's expected and is your right, and we take that into account when we do make contact with an airman, and we train our ASIs that they can expect that, and that's part of the program, and it's fully acceptable, and there's no problem with an airman saying, hey, I need some time, I'm at work, you know, I need to get my facts together. We fully understand that. So Jeff, you want to take over?
Yep, thanks, JB. And just to follow up on that concept, you know, the FAA wants that good participation. So we want airmen to provide a good factual recollection of the event because really the ultimate corrective action has to be implemented by you. And the FAA is going to say, okay, you know, in response to the deviation, you know, here's the compliance action that we're taking. But the corrective action that you take as the airman is really what's going to fix the problem. So what we want and what we're training our inspectors to do is have that open dialogue so that together the FAA and you as the airman can come to the conclusion on what the best corrective fix is. Because again, ultimately, you're the one that's going to have to implement it. So I'll note that. And then also on the contact with an airman, we received a good bit of feedback last year, a lot of it from some of the attorneys in the AOPA legal network, as well as direct feedback from the public that the letters and the correspondence that they were receiving from the FAA left them questioning whether or not the FAA was looking at enforcement or whether or not the FAA was looking at a compliance action. So we recently put some guidance out that hopefully will clear that up and alleviate that problem. Our guidance states that in any verbal communication or written correspondence that the inspector should be very clear that the event appears eligible for a compliance action, of course, if it in fact does. And if so, also note that enforcement action is not being pursued at this time. So if you have a question as to, hey, well, what's going on here? Or am I under enforcement proceedings, or we're still investigating for compliance action? It should be clear, and if it's not, you should feel free to ask that question. And then as you can see on the slides, and JB did a good job covering this, certainly refusal to speak with AFS personnel right after an event or obtaining legal counsel does not exclude you from a compliance action. Again, we want you to have your thoughts collected. We want to have a meaningful conversation. However,
Jeff, before you move on real quick, I just have one question for you. It's been our experience here that for the most part, inspectors are absolutely willing to give the airmen an appropriate amount of time to provide that information so that there's not that perception that the airman's refusing to speak to them. But we're aware of at least several cases where, for example, an inspector may have sent an email to an airman and said, well, I need your statement within the next 12 hours. And in this case, the airman was a commercial pilot, or in another, he was a firefighter coming on duty for a night shift, and he was certainly in a panic because he felt that, well, if he didn't get that information in within the next 12 hours, he's going to be facing a legal enforcement action. Can you provide some advice for airmen who might find themselves in that kind of situation?
Yeah, thanks. And I hate to hear that those situations are occurring. Again, we're focused on change management within flight standards to get the message out about compliance philosophy and really have the internal culture shift. But again, this is something that's going to take time. Now, if somebody gets an email like that, like you said, they're pressed for time, and I think you offered the suggestion earlier, Jared, which is, provide the response if you're able back to the inspector. Hey, I do want to discuss this, but I'm unable right now. Can you send me any information you have? If you're familiar with the Pilot Bill of Rights, can you send me that brochure with the annotated information, and perhaps we can schedule another time to discuss. Now, if you as the airman don't have time to do that, and the 12-hour window has unfortunately elapsed, I would just suggest do not go into panic mode. Even if we have an inspector who comes in on, I think you said Friday night, the message was sent. We have an inspector who comes in on Monday morning and does not have the response. Even if they undertake generating an enforcement report, that's got various levels of review: frontline manager, office manager, regional personnel review, and then ultimately our legal counsel within the FAA. And all of those individuals that are within the chain are also looking at the compliance philosophy, are also reading the guidance, and are also getting that training. So at some point, I would like to think that somebody would stop that and say, wait a minute, well, one of the items of proof here is the email you sent and you only gave the individual 12 hours. That's, not acceptable. That doesn't engender the critical thinking and consistency that we're stressing within our workforce. So again, I would say don't go into panic mode, and there'll be time to address the situation afterward.
Right.
And continuing on here with slide 13. So we were talking about not having to speak immediately to the inspector, or perhaps, wanting to delay the conversation until you can collect your thoughts. But, there is an extreme on the other side as well. And if the FAA cannot adequately determine the facts of the case, or can't, determine whether or not you undertook the corrective action that you had agreed to, then FAA personnel must still use diligence for the public safety. And that diligence might include a re-examination, suspension pending compliance, or other types of enforcement action. And the FAA has a statutory responsibility to ensure safety within the national airspace system. So if we don't have the information that we need in order to either adequately decide what the appropriate corrective action is, hopefully with your input, or verify that the corrective action has been taken, then we're going to have to step up our response. And I know it seems a little bit scary, but I know everyone here on this call taking time out of their evening to listen to the webinar, wants to be safe and wants certainly to share the skies with safe pilots. And both the FAA and certificate holders have that responsibility, and certainly the FAA takes its responsibility seriously. And if we have to, we'll move out of looking at a compliance action and we'll move into an enforcement action or other means to ensure compliance. Okay, so the investigation, analysis, and assessment of the problem, and JB talked about this a little bit on a previous slide, but really the purpose of the investigation and why the FAA is asking you questions, determine if there was compliance, was there a regulatory deviation, or was there a deviation from other standards, and then any necessary actions that need to be taken. And if it's a regulatory issue, the FAA is going to look at compliance action or enforcement action. However, enforcement's only to be used when it's required, and the FAA is going to look at any necessary follow-up, which will be tailored to the event. So if it's a simple on-the-spot correction, perhaps there will be no additional follow-up. If it's for a 141 school and it requires complex manual revisions, well, certainly there's going to be follow-up. So that's going to be tailored to the needs of the particular situation. Okay, and slide 15 here. A little distinction between remedial training and re-examination, otherwise known as the 44709 ride and enforcement. So if the FAA and the inspector have an idea as to what the issue is, using the example of airspace incursion, and after talking with you and looking at the facts, the inspector concludes, yeah, okay, the person is weak on navigation and can identify what that weakness is, then we're looking at a situation where remedial training would be appropriate. However, there may be some instances where we can't look at remedial training if there is just an overall question of competency. Hey, we know something's not right. We're not sure what it is. There's multiple problems here, and we got to figure out what those are. Might be looking at a re-examination. Now, a re-examination is not a punitive response to a regulatory violation. A 709 can be taken in absence of a regulatory issue. It can be in any case where the FAA is uncertain of the person's competence. And then there's enforcement. And the next slide is going to highlight this again, but a person might be demonstrating a lack of care or judgment necessary to hold that certificate, just a abandonment of safety principles and acting recklessly. And then the slide might have cut off some text there, at least it is on my screen, but we'll look at the bullet points here. So intentional or reckless deviations, those actions would not be eligible for a compliance action. We're looking at enforcement. A person who is unwilling or unable to comply. Certain matters involving lack of qualification, which we touched on the previous slide. Enforcement action required by regulation or law. Failure to complete a corrective action. And repeated non-compliance, where FAA personnel have discretion. So even if you've had a compliance action or perhaps even an admin or an enforcement action in the past, and you have a similar deviation, the FAA is compelled to take a look at that and determine if we really addressed the root cause before. Did you implement the corrective fix, but they just didn't have the intended effect, or is it this person just is unwilling to comply? So we'll take a look at the repeated non-compliance there.
Right, and Jeff, just to clarify, so that means that an airman who, perhaps received an administrative action like a warning notice within the last 2 years, so it's still on his record, it hasn't been expunged yet, or has received perhaps an enforcement action recently, which you don't get expunged, or even has had a previous compliance action. You're saying that those don't ultimately rule out whether the compliance action could be provided again, correct?
That is absolutely correct. So again, we're moving away from just, here's what, this is, there was a deviation and this is the action we're going to take. We're expecting our workforce to use critical thinking and determine the best fix for the problem. And if the best fix for the problem is another compliance action, perhaps more remedial training, additional counseling, whatever the case might be, then the workforce is empowered to take that action to correct the issue. Absolutely. So, yeah, a previous administrative action on somebody's record does not necessarily rule out a compliance action. Again, it will be on a case-by-case basis.
Right, and I'll just note quickly here for our listeners, I see a couple of these questions have come in, and we're going to address this later, but let's mention it now, and that is, even with this compliance philosophy, it's always a good idea to file a NASA ASRS, Aviation Safety Reporting System report, whenever you think that there may have been something that did not go accordingly on a flight. And so this compliance philosophy doesn't negate the recommendation to file a NASA report. Even if you file a NASA report, that will not prevent the FAA from asking you to complete or a corrective action or take a corrective action through the compliance philosophy. So for those listening, always remember that if you have any suspicion of any kind of deviation, it's always a good idea to file that NASA report within 10 days of the flight.
Yep, absolutely. It protects you as the airman, and it's also good for overall safety, because those NASA reports that you file, they're looked at in aggregate. They're put into the ASRS callback, which many of you might get as a newsletter, which highlights issues that are occurring. The one that recently came out was discussing de-icing issues, and also those issues in the NASA reports, of course, are de-identified, and they're sent to various offices within the FAA for corrective action. So it's good overall safety to file those NASA reports. So certainly please do that for all of those reasons. Real quick, because I know we're getting short on time, I'll just run through some examples when I looked back in our database over the past year, issues that I kept seeing repeated for areas where enforcement action were taken. Operating without the required certificate, endorsement, or authorization, intentional falsification or alterations of records, such as pilot and aircraft logbooks, statements indicating that the person is unwilling to take corrective action, intentional deviation from air traffic control instructions, known use of unapproved parts, intentional return of an unairworthy aircraft or component to service, operation of a clearly unairworthy aircraft, such as due to damage, operation of an aircraft beyond known required maintenance intervals, and for passengers in blatant disregard for crew member instructions. So those are some things that triggered enforcement actions over the past year. Okay, compliance actions, we've been talking about them obviously throughout this presentation, but if there's a regulatory issue resulting from a flawed procedure, mistake, lack of understanding, diminished skills, the FAA can take a compliance action instead of enforcement, and those compliance actions might include an on-the-spot correction, additional training, which is kind of a broad overview. It includes the specific remedial training that you all might know, which involves the FAST team. Also might include additional training from, say, the person's company. They're working for a repair station, or, say, in the case of a mechanic who's operating at a towered airport, has a runway or taxiway incursion going back through SIDA training can be used. Counseling, and then the improvements to systems, procedures, training programs. You can think manuals, let's say, for a 141 school. And said it before, but it's worth repeating here. A compliance action does not constitute a finding of a violation. And again, I'll hit a couple of examples here compliance actions that were entered into the system over this past year. These are directly from our database. I scrubbed them to cleanse the individuals. But here's a example of a counseling. So a state park officer observed a low-flying airplane from his boat. The officer estimated that the aircraft was less than 250 feet vertical, but it flew nearly overhead. The officer contacted the FAA to report the incident and provided the aircraft registration number. A safety inspector met with the aircraft owner, who was also the pilot, and the pilot confirmed that he was flying over the park taking low-level photos. The pilot said he didn't see the boat. The flight over the officer was inadvertent. Safety inspector counseled the pilot on minimum safe altitudes and the details of 91-119. The pilot displayed a positive attitude and noted that this was his first encounter with the FAA. The pilot stated that he would avoid repeating the violation during future flights. That was an example of a regulatory issue that was found by a law enforcement officer who contacted the FAA, and the situation was resolved without enforcement. Like I said, in that case, counseling. And then an on-the-spot correction example for a ramp check. Ramp check of a pilot discovered that the pilot did not have his identification, pilot certificate, or medical in his possession after completing the flight. The pilot stated that the required documents were in his logbook located in a nearby hangar. The pilot went to the hangar, retrieved the items, and was able to show them to the safety inspector. That was an on-the-spot correction, and that would probably be the end of the discussion there with the FAA on that one. And JB, over to you, sir.
So when we're talking about compliance action, one of the things that we take into account, of course, is any actions the airman may have already taken to respond to any type of deviation. And this may be time with their flight instructor. And part of this is identifying that they take responsibility, for the deviation. They've realized what the issues were, and they start to correct the issues even before they may be contacted by the FAA. They may be taking some wing courses, some AOPA courses, and so all that is taken into account when we look about a compliant attitude, proactive to risk management, and we encourage airmen that if a safety issue is known, that they take proactive steps, because this shows a compliant attitude, a safety-minded airman. So we take that all into account. Any training that a airman might have taken, once we contact them and we recommend remedial trainings, let's say, all that is taken into account and may go into credit for the completing remedial training. Do you have a question?
No, JB, I would just add that, I certainly agree with you as far as being proactive, and I can say that one of the first things that we recommend when someone calls in about being informed of a possible pilot deviation during a flight, or even something like penetrating a TFR, is certainly file your NAS report, and then we also recommend that they take an FAA wings course or a similar course, or depending on the severity of the situation, possibly even sit down with a flight or ground instructor, just so they have that box checked, and so when an FAA inspector calls them, that they have some sort of evidence that they are actually concerned about this, because we certainly understand that the FAA inspectors see all kinds of pilots, and we want to make sure that they know the airman they're dealing with is someone who is safety conscious and is concerned about safety.
Right. And when we take a compliance action, or we look at offering compliance action, two of the qualifying factors is the individual willing and able? And when we look at willing, we kind of went over the previous slide. They know something happened and it was their responsibility. It was their fault. There might be a lot of factors involved, but they say, yeah, they step up to the plate and say, this is something that happened. I realize it shouldn't have happened, and they take responsibility. They share the information. And part of that information sharing is not only to make sure that the FAA has the appropriate facts to mitigate the situation with appropriate compliance action, whether that be counseling or on-the-spot correction or remedial training, but it's also to share information to improve the national airspace safety, the system safety also for other pilots, because that information is shared. And promptly, willing is also promptly implements corrective action. In other words, 9 months down the road, we don't want to still be working with an airman for, let's say, running off the runway because of a crosswind. There's probably something wrong if we're continually hounding an airman to complete training, or they give excuses that may indicate that they're not willing. In 9.9% of the cases, airmen are willing, and they show a compliant attitude, and we never really have any issues. And then able. Able doesn't just mean do you have a positive attitude and can you complete the training, but you have to have the time and the resources, and that includes money, because a lot of times remedial training is you're going to have to fly with a flight instructor or take some ground training, or whatever the case may be a paid online course, some type of remedial training, but you have to have the time and the resources to complete that training. And then you have to meet the standards of the certificate you hold. So if it's a private pilot certificate, you have to meet the standards after taking that corrective action. And that's only to be expected of any pilot that holds a certificate. Now, just because we offer remedial training doesn't mean the airman has to agree to it. They may have some input, they may have reasoning and why they don't want to take remedial training, or maybe they've already taken some training and they can show proof of that. But the airman has to agree to remedial training. We can't force an airman to take remedial training as a compliance action. So you must agree and sign the remedial training agreement, and once an ASI, an aviation safety inspector, recommends remedial training, a FAST team program manager that's assigned to that office will, with the input of the aviation safety inspector, create a curriculum of training, and you will meet with that FAST team program manager and go over the details of that training. So that's your time to ask any questions or have input, and your input may change some of the training. You may have a particular school or flight instructor who is well known and respected by the FAA that you want to take that training with, and that may be fully agreeable. So, your input during the initial meeting with the FAST team program manager about your training is your time to say, to give your input on what you think could be helpful in the incident that you had. Now, during the remedial training, you're also making the understanding that you have to bear all costs associated with the remedial training. And you have to use approved training providers, and what we mean by approved training providers is, CFIs or schools, and in a local area, both the aviation safety inspector and FAST team program manager, will look at the providers, may recommend some providers, but ultimately, you and the aviation safety inspector and the FAST team program manager will agree on what the training is going to be and the provider of that training, and how that training is going to be provided, and what the completion standards of those are. Now, usually the FAA would like to see training completed within 30 days. And that's due to, again, if we have a risk factor that affects the national airspace system, we want to correct that as soon as possible. Now, 30 days isn't a drop-dead date, where if you don't complete within 30 days, RT, the remedial training is revoked. We understand there's issues of the pilot may have injuries due to whatever the deviation was. They may have a serious illness that has nothing to do, just maybe a personal illness. There may be in the middle of winter in Alaska where weather or pilot or CFI availability, aircraft availability, weather, and that's something you work out in that open communication between you and the safety inspector. And that time can be extended. And as Jeff said before on completing a compliance action within a timely manner, there's also the opposite end of the spectrum where a airman is delaying on purpose or continuing delaying, and there is a time where it can become where the airman is not compliant. In other words, they are trying to delay for a particular reason that has nothing to do with either cost or aircraft scheduling or availability of flight instructors. So, you know, it can't go on forever, but we fully understand if there are issues due to aircraft availability, flight instructors, those type of things. Just as two examples real quick, I know we're running out of time here, but two examples of what remedial training can be to give you a kind of an example, real world cases. We had one case where an airman had an accident. It was ran out of fuel, and the safety inspector talked to the pilot on the phone. He exhibited a compliant attitude, but the aviation safety inspector determined that flawed procedures and diminished skills had led to the fuel exhaustion. After the inspector looked at all the facts, he recommended remedial training under the commercial pilot practical test standards for single engine, emphasis on cross-country, flight planning, takeoffs, landings, go-arounds, navigation, and emergency procedures. It was successful. The pilot completed successfully. The aviation safety inspector followed up that all the minimum requirements were met and during the remedial training agreement. Excuse me. Excuse me, a little cough there. And follow-up was done, and both were satisfied that the remedial training was successful, and excuse me. I do apologize. And so that case was closed. Now we have another example of a maintenance inspector who was working on a helicopter, and it was discovered on this particular helicopter that there was damage to the tail rotor blades, and it seemed to be from a foreign object. It wasn't an impact during flight, you know, to terrain or an obstacle. A review of the records during the investigation revealed that there was a recent track and balance on the rotor system. And after discussing with the mechanic, it came to light that the mechanic made several adjustments to the main blades, climbing up and down the aircraft several times, and made several run-ups. And the mechanic disclosed that after the aircraft departed, he couldn't locate one of his wrenches that was used during the maintenance. And then all parties agreed it was very likely that that tail rotor damage was caused by the wrench left on top of the aircraft prior to flight. Now, throughout this investigative process, the mechanic had a constructive attitude, was cooperative, forthcoming with information, and it was determined that the human factors of complacency caused by the repetitive actions was most likely the cause. The mechanic agreed to remedial training, which consisted of several FAA Safety.gov courses, and consideration was also given to the additional training that had been provided by the company that he worked for, and that was closed. And so those are a couple examples, real-world examples of successful remedial training. And Jeff, over to you.
Thanks, JB. I appreciate that. I know we have passed our allotted time, so I will move through these last slides rather quickly. So these are some of the numbers from last year. So FY, of course, fiscal year, and the implementation of the compliance philosophy within flight standards began in FY16. So we compared the previous year to last year with the compliance philosophy. It's pretty easy to see that the number of legal and administrative cases have gone down. Those are our enforcement actions. The informal actions are no longer. Informal actions were things like counseling that the FAA could take in lieu of a legal action, but it was still part of the enforcement process. You still received the formal letter of investigation. Whereas now the compliance actions are outside of that formal enforcement process. And you can see the number of compliance actions that were taken last year. And those really represent issues that were found, regulatory deviations that were found, and are corrected without the need for enforcement.
Jeff, it was just sort of startling, the figures there, certainly to see how far we've come in terms of the decreased legal and administrative actions. The total, I'll call them touches, though, seem to have increased by about 2,000 when you do the math. Is that because there were just more instances of noncompliance, or just because the inspectors now with this tool are able to reach out to more airmen and handle the cases in a more timely manner?
Well, I think it's a little bit more of being able to handle the cases in a timely manner, and I also think it's a little bit of documentation as well. Before, when we didn't have the compliance actions, there may have been a reluctance to document, say, a small on-the-spot correction, because even the smaller regulatory issues really demanded the FAA engage in its enforcement process. So I think at least part of the numbers and the reason for them going up overall are because now we've got a mechanism to document those compliance actions. So really any deviation and any fix to it has a method of being documented within our system. And then, yeah,
right.
the increased efficiency, I think, has helped as well.
Right, and Jeff, just to echo what the numbers show on your graph there, certainly our experience here at the Legal Services Plan has been that for, the typical minor pilot deviation, the typical result of that has been a compliance action rather than, an exception. So what I mean is that most of the time when someone calls us regarding a pilot deviation, it does result in a compliance action, and we are only seeing enforcement action taken if there is some sort of aggravating factor. So even though we would caution everyone listening that you do want to be careful about how you present information to the FAA whenever you're contacted by them, do know that this is more or less the norm now for how the FAA is going to address a possible pilot deviation.
Thanks, Jared. I appreciate you pointing that out. And one of the intentions of the program was to reserve enforcement for those cases that had the aggravating factors or that were more egregious. Because of some of those cases in the past, we simply did not have the resource to get to, or when we got to them, a large amount of time had elapsed. And I'll note that on the next slide here, which talks about the timeliness. So average time to complete a compliance action was just under 4 weeks with the averages in FY16. So that includes the on-the-spot corrections, which might be done in a day or two. Also includes a remedial training, which could be 30 days or more. Also includes those larger comprehensive fixes, say at a 141 school or at a repair station. So we're looking at 4 weeks, but even with 4 weeks, that is a dramatic improvement over the time that we spent dealing with an enforcement action, which could take months for an individual or even years for a larger organization. And the current trends show that enforcements that were initiated in FY16 are being adjudicated faster, which is good for everybody involved. It's good for safety because if there really is a bad actor out there, this either brings them into compliance or removes them from the system faster. And if it is someone who is being subject to an enforcement, then it gets that process over with quicker, saves our resources on the FAA side, and allows all of us to be more efficient. We've thrown a lot of information at you. Hopefully you found it informative and useful. If you would like some more information, there are some resources. The link there at the bottom of the page, /go/CP, you'll find access to all of the guidance that we've referenced here. You'll find access to the FAA's safety briefing, which I know a lot of you read. The January-February edition of this year focused on compliance philosophy. You'll find the Pilot Bill of Rights brochure and some other things on there as well. So when you have time, I encourage you to go to the website and take a look. And that takes us to the end of the slide presentation.
Jeff, thanks a lot. And we've run past our time, but this has been great, and we've still got plenty of people on board with this. I'm going to bring up a few questions, if we can, if you guys can just hang on from members. The first one we'll put you on the spot with because there may not be an easy answer to this, but one question that did come up, and I'll just read it word for word, is what's the chance the compliance philosophy may change with a change of the administrator?
Well, of course, any change of administration, brings that little bit of uncertainty. But from my perspective, I do not believe that the compliance philosophy is going away. Even with the change of the administrator, many of the FAA executives and our senior leadership who have been promoting the compliance philosophy and believe in this program are going to remain within the agency, and there has been a lot of guidance, a lot of training, and a lot of messaging that has been put out, and it would take a tremendous amount of energy on the agency's behalf to reverse this, and to be quite frank, I don't see any reason why the agency would want to reverse this, even with a change in the administration. As we just went over some of the numbers, including the timeliness aspect, and as you as the audience have heard from the AOPA legal services attorney, this is having an impact that we want to see within aviation. So I do not see this program getting turned around.
Yeah, Jeff, I just wanted to add that once it was known that we were going to have this webinar, I was actually contacted by several of our members, and they wanted me to make sure, if I could, to let you guys know that they've gone through the process and found it very, very positive. One was even encouraged, and he's been providing short seminars to pilots in his region. Another one wrote me and says, please make sure that they know that the inspector, and I'm reading from it now, was very cordial and helpful, helped educate him, encouraged me to talk to others and use technology to support compliance with rules, very pro-GA and wanting pilots to be safe. There's been several reports I've gotten that are, many of them that have just been very positive. So I'm hopeful that you're right and that this is a more permanent presence. I'm assuming you're also finding in the field that the inspectors are encouraged in this regard.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Overall, in fact, when we first implemented the compliance philosophy, we had many inspectors contact us and say, this is great. This is the way that they've been doing business for a long time, and now there's a formal process for them to document what they're doing. And we've gotten, again, feedback from others that have said, yeah, this is the way that we've wanted to go, and now we can do it. And so that's great. And there's been a lot of questions on the details and how it works. And these concepts seem relatively simple, but there's a lot of moving parts, and we're still trying to get all those moving parts aligned. But yes, overall, the feedback that we have received within our own workforce has been very positive.
Yeah, there was one more that came up related to NASA, and the question was, can the FAA use information in a NASA report for compliance action? And the answer is no. Just like with any kind of action, those are not going to be seen by the FAA, and there's no reason to be concerned with this with respect to a compliance action. It's in fact, like we said earlier, encouraged to file those NASA reports. We do encourage our members to do that.
Right, and Jeff, another question here. You mentioned earlier that this compliance philosophy will apply to all certificate holders in the National Airspace System, which would certainly include holders of a remote pilot certificate with a small UAS rating issued under Part 107. By chance, are you aware of any compliance actions that have been taken in respect to a remote pilot?
There have been compliance actions that have been entered into the system. We were looking at some earlier, but yes, even before Part 107 became effective, the FAA put out some internal guidance on using education versus enforcement for people who are operating drones or unmanned aerial systems, and that has continued even with the effect of Part 107.
Yeah, just one. This last question was more of an administrative one from one of our members. They were asking about whether the slides will be available, and certainly we will make sure the AOPA's got them online. They usually do put them up, and they should be available.
Yeah, you will receive a link after the presentation that will direct you to where the webinar and the slides will be available.
All right. Well, we ran over a bit, but this was really great. Jeff, JB, Jared, thanks to everyone. We really do appreciate the FAA's help with this, and we wish everyone a good night. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.